Have you ever tried to help God fulfill a promise? You know that moment when waiting feels impossible and you start thinking maybe God needs your assistance to get things moving. Well, today we're diving into one of the most painfully relatable stories in Scripture where good intentions collide with divine timing and the results are messier than anyone expected. Picture this: you've been holding on to a promise for years, the kind of promise that should have happened by now, but hasn't. Every day that passes feels like evidence that maybe you misheard God, or maybe he forgot about you entirely. That's exactly where we find Abram and Sarai as we continue their incredible journey. They're still waiting for that promised son. And honestly, the biological clock isn't just ticking anymore, it's practically screaming. We left them last time having received this incredible promise under the stars. God told Abram his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. It was a breathtaking moment of faith and divine assurance. But here's the thing about promises that stretch across years instead of days. The longer you wait, the more creative your mind becomes at figuring out how God might need your help. Sarai has been watching this unfold from the sidelines. She's heard the promises, seen the miraculous interventions, but her body remains unchanged. Every morning she wakes up to the same reality. She's the woman who can't conceive in a culture where that defines everything about her worth and identity. And now God is talking about descendants as numerous as stars, but she's still the missing piece in this cosmic puzzle. So Sarai comes up with what seems like a practical solution. In their culture, it was actually acceptable for a wife to offer her servant to her husband to bear children on her behalf. The child would legally belong to the wife, and the promise could move forward. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't scandalous. It was actually quite reasonable given their circumstances. But here's where human logic meets divine timing, and things get complicated fast. Sarai approaches Abram with her plan. Take Hagar, my Egyptian servant, and have children through her. Maybe this is how God intends to fulfill his promise. Abram, who has been struggling with his own questions about timing, agrees. It makes sense. It's practical. It feels like faith in action, and it works immediately. Hagar conceives right away, which must have felt like confirmation that this was indeed God's plan. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. The moment Hagar realizes she's carrying the child that Sarai cannot, everything changes. The power dynamics in this household shift overnight. Suddenly, Hagar looks at Sarai differently. She's no longer just the servant. She's the one carrying the promised child. She's the one whose body is doing what Sarai's cannot. And that look, that subtle shift in attitude, cuts Sarai deeper than years of infertility ever did. The very solution she thought would bring joy has instead brought a different kind of pain into her home. Sarai, feeling humiliated and displaced in her own household, begins treating Hagar harshly. This woman she turned to for help has become a daily reminder of her own inadequacy. The tension becomes unbearable. Hagar, pregnant and mistreated, makes a desperate decision. She runs away into the wilderness, choosing the danger of the desert over the pain of staying. But here's where God shows up in the most beautiful way. He doesn't meet Hagar in the palace or the tent. He meets her by a spring in the wilderness when she's at her most vulnerable and alone. This Egyptian servant girl, caught up in the complicated dynamics of someone else's faith journey, discovers that God sees her personally. The angel of the Lord finds her and asks where she's going. When she explains she's fleeing from Sarai, God doesn't immediately fix the family drama. Instead, he gives her something more precious than an easy solution. He sees her pain, acknowledges her situation, and gives her a promise of her own. Her son will be named Ishmael, which means God hears, and he will become the father of a great nation. Then Hagar says something that gives me chills every single time. She calls God El Roi, which means the God who sees me. Think about this for a moment. This Egyptian woman, caught in the crossfire of someone else's attempt to help God fulfill his promise, discovers that she isn't invisible to the Almighty. Her pain matters. Her story matters. Her future matters. God tells her to return to Sarai and submit to her. But now she's returning with something that changes everything. She's returning knowing that God sees her circumstances and has plans for her son. The difficult situation hasn't disappeared, but her perspective has been transformed because she's encountered the God who sees. So Hagar returns and Ishmael is born. For a moment, it seems like the promise is being fulfilled. Abram is now a father. There's finally a son in the household. But God isn't finished with this story, and his timing still isn't our timing. Years pass, 13 more years of wondering if this was indeed the fulfillment of God's promise. Then, when Abram is 99 years old, God appears to him again with a stunning announcement. The covenant is being renewed, but with some important clarifications. Abram's name becomes Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Sarai becomes Sarah, which means princess. But here's the game changer. God makes it crystal clear that the promised son will come through Sarah, not through Hagar. Can you imagine Sarah's reaction when Abraham comes home with this news? She's 90 years old. Abraham is almost 100. And now God is saying that she, specifically she, will bear the child of promise. Her response is so human, it makes me smile. She laughs, not the laugh of joy, but the laugh of someone who thinks the situation has moved far beyond the realm of possibility. But God hears her laughter and asks the most powerful question in this entire story. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's a question that cuts through decades of waiting, years of doubt, and months of helping God with his timing. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And then it happens. At 90 years old, Sarah conceives. The woman who spent most of her life defined by what her body couldn't do discovers that God's timing really is perfect, even when it seems impossible. Isaac is born, and his name means laughter. The laughter of disbelief becomes the laughter of joy. But the story doesn't end with a neat bow tied around it. Remember, there are now two sons in Abraham's household, Isaac, the child of promise, and Ishmael, the child of human effort to help God along. And where there are two sons with different mothers in the same household, there's going to be tension. Sarah watches Isaac and Ishmael playing together, but she sees something that concerns her. Maybe it's the way Ishmael relates to Isaac, or maybe it's her own fear that Ishmael's presence will somehow diminish Isaac's inheritance. Whatever she sees, Sarah makes a decision that must have broken Abraham's heart. She asks him to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham is torn. Ishmael is his son too. He loves this boy who has been part of his household for years. But God speaks to Abraham and tells him something crucial. Listen to Sarah in this matter. The lineage of promise will continue through Isaac, but Ishmael will also become a great nation because he is Abraham's son. So with a heavy heart, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness, but this time, Hagar isn't running away. She's being sent out with provisions and with God's promise that her son has a future. Still, when the water runs out and death seems imminent, she places Ishmael under a bush and walks away because she can't bear to watch her child die. But God hears. Remember, Ishmael means God hears. In their darkest moment, when hope seems gone, God calls to Hagar from heaven. He opens her eyes and she sees a well of water. He provides exactly what they need to survive. He keeps his promise to both sons, even though they're walking different paths. Here's what this story teaches us about our own attempts to help God fulfill his promises. God doesn't need our panic. He doesn't need our backup plans. He doesn't need us to figure out the how when he's already promised the what. Waiting isn't wasted time in God's economy. It's often the very space where he's preparing us for what he wants to give us. Sarah's decades of waiting weren't empty years. They were preparation years. God wasn't late with Isaac. Isaac came at exactly the right time for God's purposes. And Hagar's detour into the wilderness wasn't a mistake either. It was where she encountered God personally and discovered that he sees her circumstances even when others don't. Sometimes our attempts to help God reveal more about our trust issues than our faith. When we can't wait for his timing, when we try to create our own solutions to his promises, we often create complications that wouldn't have existed if we trusted his timeline from the beginning. But here's the beautiful truth that runs through this entire story. God's faithfulness doesn't depend on our perfect faith. Even when we make messes trying to help him, he doesn't abandon his promises. He works through our mistakes, redeems our poor choices, and continues moving toward his purposes. Sarah's plan to use Hagar created genuine heartache and family dysfunction, but God didn't throw up his hands and find a different family to work with. He continued loving them through the mess, providing for everyone involved, and ultimately fulfilling his promise in his perfect timing. This story also shows us that God's promises often have implications we never considered. Sarah thought her inability to conceive was just her personal tragedy. She had no idea that God was planning to do something so miraculous through her that it would be remembered for thousands of years. Her waiting wasn't just about her. It was about establishing a pattern of God's supernatural intervention that would echo through history. And Hagar's story reminds us that even when we're caught up in other people's faith journeys, God sees us individually. Her pain mattered to God. Her future mattered to God. She wasn't just a supporting character in Abraham and Sarah's story. She had her own relationship with the God who sees. If you're in a season of waiting right now, if you're holding a promise that feels overdue, if you're tempted to help God figure out the logistics of his own plan, take heart from this story. Your waiting is not evidence that God has forgotten you. It might be evidence that he's preparing to do something so much bigger than you imagined that it requires perfect timing. Maybe you've already tried to help God fulfill his promise and created some complications along the way. Sarah's story reminds us that God can work through our messes. He doesn't need our perfect faith to accomplish his perfect purposes. He just needs our willingness to trust that his timing really is better than ours. And if you're feeling invisible, if you're caught up in circumstances that feel beyond your control, remember Hagar's discovery. You serve El Roi, the God who sees you. Your situation may be complicated by other people's choices, but you're not forgotten. God has plans for your future that don't depend on other people's faith journeys. The tension between Isaac and Ishmael would continue for generations, becoming part of a larger story that we're still watching unfold today. But that tension doesn't negate God's faithfulness to both sons. Sometimes God's promises create complexities we didn't anticipate, but his character remains consistent throughout. This week, I want to challenge you to examine your own heart. Where are you trying to help God fulfill his promises? What situations are causing you to panic instead of trust? Where do you need to surrender control and embrace his timing instead of trying to create your own solutions? Take some time to journal about the promises God has given you that haven't been fulfilled yet. Ask him to show you whether you're walking in faith or operating in fear. Pray about your tendency to want to control outcomes instead of trusting his process. And remember, you serve a God who keeps his word, even when the timing looks different than you expected. He sees your waiting, he understands your impatience, and he's working out his purposes in ways that are far better than anything you could orchestrate on your own. Thanks for joining me today as we walked through this beautifully messy chapter of Abraham and Sarah's story. Next time, we're going to see God ask Abraham to do something that will test every ounce of faith he's developed over these years of walking with him. It's a story that will challenge everything we think we know about trust, sacrifice, and God's heart for his people. If this encouraged you today, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this incredible journey. Until next time, keep trusting God's timing over your own understanding, and remember that his faithfulness doesn't require your perfect faith. Wherever you are, in whatever you're walking through, I want you to know that God sees you, he knows your heart, and he loves you more than you can imagine. You're never out of his reach, and you're never out of his care. If this time together encouraged you, feel free to like and subscribe so you can join me again. I'll see you next time.